Hi, everybody. My name is Miss Amber, and I'm here with your English 11A live lesson for today. Now, this lesson is going to be on Transcendentalism, which is the fifth lesson of the second unit. I know the second unit is pretty long for English 11. I'm going to go ahead and get started, though, and share my screen. So they start off here with a video about Ralph Waldo Emerson. So they give you a lot of information in this video just about who he was and what he represented as a person. And they also just talk a lot about his contributions. I'm sorry. I don't know where my mind is today. They start off giving you information about his contributions to the Transcendentalism movement. So it's centered on this man's writings. He's basically like the nucleus, the center where everything is focused for this movement. He basically came out with these writings, and people kind of latched onto them and was like, you're onto something. So pretty much this gives you a summary of what the movement was. It's basically an offshoot of Romanticism. Actually, let me move myself up real quick. Okay. It's an offshoot of Romanticism. And if you don't remember from previous lessons or classes, the Romantic era basically was about people focusing on individual feelings, memories, emotions, and nature. So it was supposed to be showing people the beauty of nature as a response to things that were happening in the Industrial Revolution at the time. And through showing people the beauty of nature and the depth, how deep human thought could be, how deeply attached we can be to our personal thoughts, it was supposed to offer a bit of like a rest, a respite, kind of a relief from the day-to-day for people who were working in factories and couldn't actually like have time leisurely to themselves to enjoy things or think deeply on things. So it was based mostly on his writings. And the central work of the movement is a specific thing he wrote called Nature, which was published in 1836. And it pretty much is a poem that embodies all of the features of Transcendentalist literature that we're going to get into in these next couple slides. So the takeaway from this video is that this is an offshoot of Romanticism. Remember that the important factors of Romanticism are focus on nature, focus on the self, personal emotions and connections, and simplicity. And they're centered on the writings of this man here, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And that it was based very specifically, even more than just his writings, based on a specific thing he wrote called Nature. Let's see. Okay, so on this slide, they pretty much give you the rundown on what Transcendentalists believed in. They celebrated and respected the natural world, which is the romantic connection that we were talking about before on the last slide. And they basically tried to use observations and things that they saw in nature to explain or relate to human behavior. They believed that the connection to nature and human behavior was also closely related to God because God made both, right? So they felt like you can find the presence of God in all things. So by coming into contact with nature more often, centering yourself, contemplating and thinking deeply about it, and appreciating the higher power that made nature, you can transcend or move beyond. That's basically what transcend means. Similar to like the move even further beyond meme that you see online. So the idea is to move beyond the decisions that you have to make for every day, the mundane, unimportant decisions you make, and sort of understand more about life than just going to work and coming home and material things. So there's a lot of transcendentalism in uh, influence things that we see today. A lot of the time, people are urged to step back and to think about the fact that more exists beyond like just going to work, making money, trying to survive. And these are things that most people can relate to. And remember that all of this was a response to the Industrial Revolution, which is when people started living close to factories, working at factories, and there was so much demand for things to be made in factories that people were just working inhumane hours. There was a lot of technology that came up at the time, but none of it was really used to improve life for anyone who was working in these places. So yeah, this was an offshoot of Romanticism that focused on becoming one with the divine and with God by appreciating nature. So not doing it just for the sake of doing it, but doing it to reach the goal of having a deeper understanding of life. You know, whenever you have a television show or a movie that shows someone, you know, looking off in the distance and then they say something that's very profound, that's inspired by transcendentalism. And then the second paragraph talks about when it began to fade. It began to fade from being important in American literature, or at least being like famous, as the Civil War years approached. So it wasn't a super long period of time. But a lot of transcendentalists that were involved in this literary movement were influential in the civil rights movement that took place in the 20th century. And a lot of them were anti-slavery and abolitionists because they didn't believe that slavery was the natural state of things. The reason why this is mentioned, and I want to mention this, is because it's very easy to view history as something that happens over a very like spread out amount of time. But the Industrial Revolution was not too far away from when the Civil War happened in America. So these were two different countries, but these things were happening at the same time. So Romanticism literature was coming up in Britain during the same time as things rumbling in the US to start the Civil War. Transcendentalist literature influenced people who took part in the war and who advocated for certain things. So it's important to note that like these events that we're covering, when you learn more about the background behind things that people write, these are not things that happen in a vacuum. History doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not like, oh, well, this was like this for an extremely long time and no one knew anything except this one era until another one started. That's not quite how it works. There's lots of overlapping events that affect each other, even if they're happening in different places in the world. Okay, now here we go. We have a timeline of transcendentalist literature. I'm going to try to knock this out as quickly as I can and just touch on the important points. So remember that on the previous slide, we were talking about the Civil War being in 1860 to 1865, right? So just starting here on this timeline, we're already starting from 1837. So at this point, we're like only 30 years apart. The Transcendentalist movement wasn't very long. 3 decades is not very long. That's not even someone's full life. So we're going to start off in 1836 with the Transcendental Club. Clubs were basically like almost like kind of brunch with the girls sort of thing. But people formed these clubs to meet with like-minded people. So think of like the clubs that you have at school. We have some clubs here at MBA for different interests and stuff. This was literally the same thing before adults. So if you didn't have a place where you could talk about how you felt about certain politics that were happening at the time or certain ideas that you wanted to give more attention to, you could look for a club that met regularly and discussed those things. And that's how people who were in those schools of thought like exchanged ideas and learned more about the topic that they were talking about. Sometimes they would have people who had studied things come in and like share information and things like that. So they would like pick a place where it was safe to meet and discuss basically the topics that surrounded whatever their interest was. So in this case, it was the transcendentalist thought pattern and philosophy. So they talked about American transcendentalism at their first meeting. And that included Ralph Waldo Emerson, the guy that we talked about from the first slide, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Margaret Fuller. They give you a list of other names here: Amos Bronson Alcott and Henry David Thoreau. And this was the same year that Emerson published Nature, which basically ended up becoming like the pillar of the movement. Here in 1837, Emerson, he's the guy that jump-started the movement. He delivered the speech, The American Scholar, at Harvard University, and he used a lot of transcendentalist viewpoints to explain the relationship between nature and the American scholar, so a person who's trying to learn. So he basically talked about the concept of man thinking, which was basically how he referred to older views that people get taught and passed down. He thought that it was very important for people to think for themselves and to be inspired by how the world naturally is when you are trying to think for yourself, because it makes sense for the physical human world to have elements of the natural world in it, and they shouldn't just be eliminated for efficiency or technology. So the next one thing here is the Dial. So the Dial is a transcendentalist journal. So in these times, journals were basically small newspapers or pamphlets where people could publish things that had a similar theme. We do actually still have journals today, but usually journals that people have today revolve around like creative writing specifically. Sometimes in journals, you would find people who were making intellectual arguments as well. And the transcendentalist subject kind of fits in the middle of this. It's a little philosophical, so there's some logic that people are supposed to take and do something with. It is trying to convince you of something. It's trying to convince you that being inspired by nature and focusing on nature is how you attain, like enlightenment as a human. And even though there are lots of poems that are artistic way of telling you that, in terms of literature, at the heart of it is that message. So this was kind of a mix of both of those things. You had art from the poetry, and then the message that it was trying to impart, which was a little more trying to prove something through in like a scientific sense of saying this is what's best for humanity. So at first, this journal was made fun of and ridiculed because it published Orphic sayings, which was basically a collection of sayings by Amos Bronson Alcott that we saw in the Transcendentalist Club point on this timeline. Basically, the sayings were criticized as being silly and incoherent. So I'm going to go ahead and give you this example here. We're going to read through it just so that you have it. It says, nature bears never her bones, clothed in her own chaste rhetoric of flesh and blood, of color and feature, she is elegant and fair to the sense. And thus, O philosopher, poet, prophet, be thy words, thy scriptures, thy thought, like Pallas, shaped bold and comely from thy brain, like Venus, formed quick from thy side, mystic as Memnon, melodious as the lyre of Orpheus. So, just to sort of break down what he's saying here to give you an idea of how silly it might be or might not be. Nature, we all know what that is. It says never bears her bones. So basically, nature doesn't show its secrets to you. It says it's clothed in her own chaste rhetoric of flesh and blood. So she's talking about he's talking about nature being personified as a person that doesn't spill her secrets and that is clothed in basically what we see on the surface. So like the land, the animals, the trees and stuff, he's referring to these things as clothes that cover up the secrets of nature. That's just what we see on the outside and not the things that might be hidden underneath the earth or in secret places, things like that. And then it says of color and feature. So he's again talking about the the things that we enjoy about nature, the different colors, the different shapes of things, how animals exist, all of those things. She is elegant and fair to the sense. So this is a direct comment on how nature should affect people. They're saying that nature is elegant and fair to like your human senses. So you enjoy being outdoors and hearing birds sing. You enjoy the sun on a sunny day, feeling the warmth on your skin. You enjoy smelling like pleasant flowers, that kind of thing. He's talking about nature being appealing specifically to human senses. And then it says, and thus a philosopher. So he's talking to the writer. He's saying, like, whoever you are, be it philosopher, so someone who thinks about thinking, poet, someone who writes, or prophet, someone who is looking into how the future is going to unfold. Basically, it almost becomes a prayer at this point. He's wishing whoever it is that reads this excerpt to be like, basically he's mentioning some Roman characters from like Roman mythology. Pallas, Venus, and Memnon are historical figures. So he's listing different types of traits that they have. So we have like shaped, bold, and comely from thy brain. And then we have like Venus formed quick from thy side, and melodious as a lyre of Orpheus. So he's just listing traits, and he's saying, because nature doesn't reveal her secrets, but she's pleasant to interact with, let it inspire you to have these traits like these other mythological characters. So whether or not that's silly is kind of up to you, but people thought that this was silly at the time because it's like it starts off as something that's almost scientific, basically saying people need to pay attention to nature more. Nature is worth more of our attention. It doesn't spill its secrets. You should enjoy it the way it is without digging too deeply. But then it goes into almost a prayer of, you know, wishing you, the reader, like different traits while you're going along your life. And people are like, well, what is the point of this? What is the point of what he's saying? So his sayings like this are still not widely praised, but some people argue that there's more meaning to them than people knew back then, and that there's more connection to be made. All right. That one was a little long because it had the excerpt, and I wanted to go through and explain to make sure that you understood it, but hopefully we'll be able to blow through some of these a little quickly. So we've got Brook Farm and Self-Reliance in 1841. So there's a transcendentalist named George Ripley. He founded Brook Farm, which was basically an experiment to see if transcendentalists could survive in like a utopian or perfect community. So he wanted to focus on transcendentalist goals. So basically, if people live a transcendentalist lifestyle, can they survive? And some of the goals that they had for that lifestyle were individual freedom, spiritual awakening, and communal relationships. So basically attempting to mimic nature and animals with more focus on the individual doing things for themselves, but also serving a community. And during this same year, Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, which came from a series of essays that he published, came out. And it basically talks about how self-reliance is super important to transcendentalism. And he talks about different ways that society tries to get you to be dependent and to conform to what they want. But that basically being self-reliant, being able to only rely on yourself and take care of yourself, makes it harder for government structures to try to tell you what to do. Okay, so 1845, we have transcendental feminism and Walden. So we have Margaret Fuller. Remember, she was part of the Transcendentalist Club. She came out with a book called Woman in the 19th Century, and this was in 1845. So she was a very educated woman, which was not very common for women at the time, but she was greatly respected for her intelligence specifically. And her book is pretty much another great example of transcendentalist values. It basically speaks on gender equality, education for women, and why these things are in line with the transcendentalist view. When you are a transcendentalist, it doesn't really matter what gender you are. You're supposed to be able to have that self-reliance and be able to use your knowledge and your skills to take care of yourself, but also contribute to a community. So she definitely wrote about how transcendentalism can work as sort of like a haven for women who want more independence, because women were in fact not independent at this time. Also in 1845, Henry David Thoreau, he's another transcendentalist author. He built a small cabin at Walton Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. Now, this was covered a little bit in other lessons about the Romantic period, because Henry David Thoreau's poems are often considered romantic and transcendentalist. Since they're very similar, it falls into both categories. But he built that cabin and began to write about the process of building it, of being self-reliant, of being inspired by nature and stuff. And he ended up publishing a book called Walden. And there are excerpts from this book and from poetry that he's written specifically about romanticism. So he's more so known for being a romantic poet than he is a transcendentalist, but he was in fact both. His writings fall into both, but his personal beliefs were definitely transcendental. Now, in 1846, we have the Mexican-American War and mosses from an old manse. So let's see. Basically, the Mexican-American War happened after the United States annexed Texas, or decided to take it over. It was controlled by Mexico, but once the US took it, basically war broke out. So people were on both sides talking about, well, you can't take this because you still owe us stuff. There was a lot of debt agreements that were broken between like smaller communities in favor of like the American government at the time, just deciding, you know, like, we don't want to be bothered with what everyone else is doing. We want this piece of land. Also at this time, this is when manifest destiny, this is something you might have heard of, was popular. This is when people believed that it was a God-given right for people to just sort of like go westward to take control of the land to the west of the United States. Basically, they felt like because the United States, the ones that currently existed on the East Coast and in the Midwest, they felt like because they were economically stable and that they had a democracy that was fair, they felt like it was their right to rule all of North America and spread their way of thinking and believing and ruling, governing, I should say, to the rest of the United States, or to the rest of North America. So because they were basically insulting Mexico by saying we're better than you politically and we have more money than you, it just sort of evolved into war. So around the same time, Nathaniel Hawthorne, he's a transcendentalist. He published a short story collection called Mosses from an Old Manse. And he basically named the collection of poems after a place that he lived for a while. And there were short stories in there that were transcendentalist in nature and that basically talked about the negative aspects of human nature as seen through more natural external nature. All right, we only got two more. 1849, Henry David Thoreau publishes Civil Disobedience. It's the official name is of the essay is Resistance to Civil Government, but the shortcut name that it ended up having, the nickname, is Civil Disobedience. He basically was inspired by being arrested for not paying a $1 poll tax. And he refused to pay this tax as a way to protest the US involvement in the Mexican-American War. He was like, if we just stay in our own lane and just sort of like deal with taking care of ourselves, we won't have to pay extra taxes to fund a war that we don't believe in. And his civil disobedience was just in general about how important it is to refuse to obey laws that you don't think are correct for the sake of um, protest. If you don't think that a law is right, then you have the right to protest by not obeying the law. And civil disobedience is something that's used a lot for protests now. But this was one of the places where it officially was given a name as like a concept and an idea. Like, don't get me wrong, there were people who obviously broke laws before because they didn't believe they were just. That was kind of the point of the colonies not paying taxes to Britain, for example. But it wasn't really given a name as a concept until this, and it became popular. And then this last one, we have the Compromise of 1850. So basically, this was a bunch of bills that were executed by Congress in 1850 to sort of relieve some pressure between the North and Southern states. You have to remember that when the U.S. was first formed as a nation, there was a certain number of states in the South and a certain number of states in the North. Now, people basically considered the state that they were in a free state or a slave state based on whether or not slavery was considered legal there. So remember that the colonies in the US, once it formed as a nation, the whole US wasn't formed yet. People were still expanding westward. Remember, we were talking about manifest destiny. So whenever they would take in new land and make a new state, there was always kind of a fight between the North and South in terms of government stuff to figure out which side was going to get a new state, or would they break the land up into enough pieces for both sides? Because the South thought it would be unfair for the North to have like more votes for states that are free states. And the North thought it was unfair for the South to continue to insist on having slaves and threatening to like leave the Union and things like that. So basically, they split different land up that they took over via manifest destiny. Here we've got the territories of New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. And it allowed the inhabitants of those regions to decide the issue of slavery in their territory. So instead of having everyone who was already part of the Union fight, they basically said, we should let the people who live there decide if they want to be a free state or a slave state. That way it's fair. We don't have to worry about people squabbling or voting or bribing or anything. We'll let the people who live there decide. That's what this was about. So California was brought in as a free state, and slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C. But I think that there were a couple other territories that were brought in as slave states. They even moved around the status of some states based on like trying to keep a balance. It says here that the Congress also passed as part of this act, the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed people to cross state lines to get runaway slaves back. It was a very controversial law, but pretty much what the Southern states said was, well, we know you're going to try to pressure people who live in the new territories to be free states. So if you don't allow us to be able to come get our slaves that run away to free states, we're threatening war is pretty much what happened. Things were very tense at this point. The Civil War only happened like I want to say 10 years after this. So there was a lot of tension behind just the thought of which territories would be free states or slave states at this time. And again, like I was saying before, Transcendentalism was happening at the same time that this was happening, leading up to the Civil War. This is only like a 30, or so year period until the Civil War started in 1861. So all of the transcendentalist stuff was happening at the same time while all of these issues were being decided in the US, and the war between Mexico and America was also happening. Alrighty. So self-reliance was mentioned in one of the timeline sections, and that's what we're going to read a bit today in this is the reading selection. Self-reliance was a very important essay for the Transcendentalists. So this is what we've picked for today. Now, as for usual, I don't go over the excerpts because I think it's important for you guys to try to read it on your own. But in the next slides, I definitely will go over the analysis for them. And we can talk about what's in them, because sometimes it's better to actually go over what you're going to find in the readings before you go back and read. Because that way you'll know what you're looking for. And if you see something, if you understand the idea of it, it helps make the connections a little easier. So it'll help you hold on to it a little more for the test. Okay, so this slide basically just gives you information about Ralph Waldo Emerson. So he was one of the first American transcendentalists. He was born in New England. He lived with his aunt. And basically his aunt was the person he gives credit to for helping him to learn how to live independently. He began his writing career in 1833 after getting married, and that's when he published Nature, which was like the very first definitive work in Transcendentalism. His works were pretty well respected and admired both in and out of the Transcendentalist community. And he's pretty much known as like the leader of Transcendentalism. His motto, which is very important to the Transcendentalist philosophy, is trust thyself. And that's one of the phrases from the self-reliance essay. Let's see. Okay, so before you get reading, they want to talk to you about verifying a text here in this lesson. Basically, they just think it's important for you to know that authors often say things just because and claim that they are true. Just because you're reading something in one of these lessons, just because you read an idea in an old document, you read an idea in the Constitution, you read an idea in an old essay like this one, or you read someone saying that something is a fact in a book or a short story. It's important to know and be able to tell whether or not it's actually the truth, a mixture of a truth and opinion, a mixture of some information that's related to the truth, but not quite true in the author's opinions. You can't just believe everything that you read. You know, everyone has their own thoughts. Transcendentalism was a movement of people who thought the same way about deriving the divine and getting close to God from nature. Not everyone believes in those things. Not everyone is religious. Not everyone loves nature that much. Not everyone sees value in nature the same way. So they give you an example here. There's a line in Self-Reliance that says, whoso would a man be must be a nonconformist. So what he's saying is that in order to be considered truly independent, you have to refuse to abide or follow society's rules. But that's such an extreme statement. There are some rules in society that actually make sense, like not stealing from people, not harming people, it being illegal to harm people unless you're defending yourself. These kinds of things, and I mean, like, the laws are not perfect, obviously, but there are some societal rules that do make sense, or that would make sense if everyone actually followed them well. That's the whole idea of the law. The idea is some people won't follow them, but the idea is that if most people do, then we'll have like some relative peace. So for him to say in this essay, you know, you have to refuse to abide by society's rules altogether, it's like, you know, I'm with you about disregarding some things because they don't make sense, or they're from an older time that doesn't apply anymore. So maybe don't follow those. But to say that all of society's rules are ridiculous is kind of saying a lot. So whenever you hear or see statements like this is why it's important to not just drag your eyes across the page when you read, but actually try to understand what a text is telling you. Because not everything in a text is true. Not everything in a text is definitely a lie. Sometimes when you're reading old things, you're just reading about the opinions that these people have about these topics at the time. Okay, And the second part that's important is just information on expository text. So that's what kind of text self-reliance is. So expository, the biggest example for understanding what expository is I link it with the word explain. They both start with exp. So it's easy for me to remember expository, explain. Expository texts are types of text that are trying to explain something to you. So those both of those words fit into the definition, so it's just easier to remember. It explains or gives you information about a topic. And let's see, I think they give you, let's see. Oh, nope, I took this from one of the other lessons. Okay, so expository texts are also known as informational texts. So remember that you remember to have that in your notes. Expository equals explain. If you were looking at an expository text, then the point of you having it is for it to give you information. And it says, since expository writing aims to provide factual information, readers may assume that this type of text has nothing more to offer than simply the words on the page. But sometimes you can make inferences, that means guesses on your own based on the information that's in the text you're reading, and draw conclusions about the ideas they read by pulling relevant details from the text themselves. They pretty much just explain what inferences are. So the goal is for you to actually take a look at what's being said, look at the ideas and the examples, and to try to draw your own conclusion from there. Don't just believe something or repeat it just because you read it. So then they give you a couple of examples of texts that are expository that might make you might make you think. So the first question is, what inferences can be made about a text where the author shows a strong affinity or dislike for the subject in the text? So for example, if you read an essay about someone who thinks that going outside is awful, they actually hate that. They hate pretty much going outside in any weather. They don't enjoy looking at nature. They don't enjoy even just being outdoors, fresh air, that type of thing. They think it's just safer for you to be in your home because there aren't as many threats. If you read an essay like that, you kind of have to use information that you find in the text about the person being afraid to go outside and draw from your own information about having been outside to come to a conclusion that the piece is biased. Obviously, people have to go outside for some things, right? So you have to use your information that you know about and look at the text itself and the words that are used and what's being said to sort of draw a conclusion. They give you another more practical example. So here we have a discussion about a textbook from a library about cloning organisms. So after reading that the first organism cloned was a tadpole in 1952 and that a sheep was cloned in 1996, what might you conclude? So these are two pieces of information that they're giving you. They're giving you that the first organism or living thing that was cloned was a tadpole in 1952. So they gave you a thing, they explained why it was important. It was the first, and they gave you a date, 1952. And then the second piece of information they gave you is that a sheep was cloned in 1996. So what you're supposed to do is try to put those two pieces of information together. And what you would conclude, or the piece of information that you can assume based on that, is that cloning is an area of science that has been developing. So we've got these dates, 1952 and 1996. So obviously people have been doing experiments in between that time. That's more than 40 years. So that's a lot of time for people to do research and try to figure things out. So you might actually, conclude that it's still a developing area of science because people are still doing experiments. And that if we've only gone maybe from a tadpole to a sheep, we're still pretty far away from cloning humans. So there's more types of research that would be required to clone things that are bigger than a sheep, maybe, right? So that's an example of inference. You're taking the information that's there and thinking, what does this information mean when I put it all together? What is this author trying to tell me? And they add a note at the bottom that inferences and conclusions are drawn from information in the text. So like the organism cloning thing, these two pieces of information about the tadpole and the sheep, these are the same across every copy of that book, every copy of the article that has like that discussion, right? So everyone's supposed to draw the same conclusion. If you know that the first organism cloned was in 1952 and it was a tadpole, and a sheep was cloned in 1996, you and anyone else that reads that information should come to a similar point of view about it. What we know from the information is that cloning is still being developed. What we know is that the last thing that was cloned, according to this book, was a sheep. So there's going to be a lot of interest. There's going to be a lot of development in that field, even into the future, because we haven't reached like an end game or a goal for cloning yet. You can kind of conclude that the idea behind cloning is to eventually be able to clone a human. And if we are not there yet, then there's still research to do. So even if you have like a personal thought about this information, like, oh, I don't think we should be cloning things, that's your opinion. That's not an inference. An inference is when you take two pieces of information from what you are reading and figure out something that is safe to assume from the information that's there. Your personal responses are not part of an inference. So they have to be, all the conclusions that you draw have to be from the text itself, not from your thoughts. Alrighty. Okay, so now we're getting into the analysis of self-reliance. If you're one of those people that tries to read it and then, come back to this point in the video, feel free to do that. If you are a student that wants to hear this first and then you'll go through and read it, then do that. But basically, to summarize this slide, self-reliance is pretty much, it says here, quintessential transcendentalist literature. So quintessential means like the pinnacle, the biggest, the thing that embodies something the most. So you can't get more transcendentalist than this text. It embodies every single point on the list of transcendentalist literature. It gives you instructions on how to live life, because remember, this is a movement trying to convince people to connect to nature and use that as inspiration to live their life. But at the same time, it insists that you follow your intuition instead of following society's rules. The argument that transcendentalists make is that your instincts as a human is one of the most natural things that exist. So you shouldn't just ignore whatever it is you have going on the inside to follow just the rules that a government puts out for the betterment of itself. You need to be self-reliant. You need to remember that, animals in the wild don't have governments or cities, and that you should rely on yourself, take inspiration from nature, which is around you, where creatures and animals and people have to fend for themselves. And use that to sort of like follow your heart, so to speak, and do what needs to be done. And then they give you an excerpt here. And basically the excerpt just says that you need to accept who you are and rely on yourself. That's pretty much what it says. There's a time in every man's education where he arrives at the conviction that he must take himself, for better, for worse, as his portion. So they mean your portion, what life dealt you, that's what you have. And you have to accept the personality, the thought processes, you as a concept. There comes a certain point where you realize you can't change yourself to make other people happy. You have to deal with you. And then it says that though this wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given to him to till. So he's basically saying there's a lot of good things in the world, but nothing will be more nourishing than you being able to take care of yourself. Now, this is from a point in time period where people could actually take a plot of land and build their own, like house on it. If you had the correct amount of money or you were born into the correct class. So that already tells us that, there are a few different flaws to this argument. But the general point of this is, regardless of if you have land or not, if you have a job, if you're taking care of a family, you should work to take care of yourself. it's important to be independent. Okay. And it just goes on here. No matter what gifts you're given, be it land, seeds, personality, or talents, you have to nurture that to get to your full potential. Whatever it is that you do well, do it the best. Help yourself figure out how to do it the best so that you can make a living off of it and provide for yourself. And he also talks about people only feeling good about a day's work when they do their best. So again, just transcendentalist, philosophy here. In nature, everyone has to work their hardest to earn things for themselves. It's so much more satisfying for you to have things of your own when you know that you earned them. So he says that complete and honest hard work is self-reliance. And basically, it's supposed to be a logical essay that explains a lot of the transcendentalist ideals. So valuing the trust you have in yourself, valuing independence, your skills, and he talks about how important it is to take those talents and beliefs and follow them instead of just following what society or what religion tells you to. They give you a question here from the excerpt that says, what have I to do with the sacredness of traditions if I live wholly from within? So basically, if you find God through nature, if you commune with God on your own, if you pray every day because that's what your heart tells you to do, outside, if you have that connection to God through nature, then you don't have to depend on a church to free your soul and to guarantee your salvation. You have to also remember, though, that historically during this time, this was back when pretty much the church was still encouraging people to come in, and people were not happy with the idea of everyone being able to have their own version of the Bible and translate it themselves. Like, the church needed people to be reliant on them at that time, just so that it could survive by virtue of being popular. So at this time, a lot of people were in fact talking about how important it is for you to be able to have your own personal connection with God. And transcendentalism is a part of that too. So you can sort of see a lot of the different influences that different historical events and the development of like religion and society had on the stuff that people wrote at this time. Okay. Now, the second reading selection for this section is Walden by Henry David Thoreau. So this was the guy that went out to Walden Pond. He built himself a cabin and he wrote a short story about his life there. So he basically, they give you his backstory here. He met Emerson and became interested in the Transcendentalist movement. And they give you some other information about him. He was born in 1817 and raised in Massachusetts. And he also met Ralph Waldo Emerson and just became interested in the whole movement from there. Emerson and him were close, and Emerson gave him advice about writing. And that's basically what got him into it. Now they talk about a couple different things here in terms of things that affected his writing. Thoreau's brother died, and he was in grief about it for a long time. He moved to New York to pursue writing, but he didn't like it. And his works didn't really pop off the way he wanted them to. And that's when he built his cabin at Walden Pond. And he just, you can tell that his decision to move out there was affected by the fact that his brother was gone. Sometimes you just have to get away and go to the woods. Am I right? So he lived alone in the cabin for like 2 years and tried to be completely self-sufficient. So farming his own crops, making his own food, trying to like be as separate from humanity as possible. And he kept a journal, which was like an account of his life during that time. And he published it as Walden or Life in the Woods. So they're going to give you an excerpt from this and then discuss like the analysis of it. So again, I don't read over excerpts. If you need help with getting through any of the excerpts from any of these lessons, make sure that you are in contact with your advocate or your teacher so that they can get you in contact with an English tutor. It'll be either me or Kathy Vahovic, and we can read through the excerpt with you to help you understand. I am going to go over the analysis as per usual, but I want you to take the information you get from this analysis and then go back and try to read the text to make these connections. Now, they start off with telling you that he uses a lot of imagery. That's one of the biggest things. So remember, imagery is language that you use that's supposed to help the person who is reading to form a picture of what you're describing. It's supposed to use like sort of vivid images to describe whatever it is that's happening. It also involves using like bright language that makes people think of pictures, sounds, smells. You're basically using words to play on memories or things that the reader is familiar with that they can piece together to get a picture of what you're describing. So there's a lot of imagery in Walden, and especially in the excerpt that you're reading here. And they tell you here, one of note is about the importance of living simply. And basically in this excerpt featured here on this slide, Thoreau uses the picture of a chopping sea to talk about how rough life is. So he compares life to the sea. And how it can be unexpected. People can't control water. They can only try to navigate it. So you're supposed to see the parallels, the things that life and water, the sea has in common, and say, oh, that's like really clever because these things have certain things that are alike. He talks about the choppiness as an argument for living simply. So he's like, life can just get to be really complicated, just like choppy, tumultuous, or, like seas that are just like not settled. So what you need to do is find a good section of water that is just calm, well-behaved, peaceful, and that's where you put things down. So that's supposed to be a metaphor for transcendentalism. Don't get a big boat and try to fight the waves. Just find something that works for you and keep it simple. He talks about the hectic sea being civilized life. So people use the word civilized to describe life, but there are lots of things that happen in life, including crime, including, injustice, or just the way that people are treated. That's not very civilized at all. And he's basically saying, that these things are interrupted by clouds and storms and quicksand. So that's the analogy he's making to the issues that come up in life. And he's like, if you just break away from all of that and just find, like a good, calm body of water, you can just stay in your lane, stay in your space, manage yourself instead of being mixed up with everyone else, and things will be fine. So he's pushing self-reliance from the stance of just not wanting to get caught up in everything that's happening in life because it's too chaotic. Let's see. Oh yes, he continues to emphasize the importance of simplicity by describing the need to cut down on excess. So excess in this case is too much of things. So he talks about basically how part of what makes life complicated is people wanting too many things, people desiring too many things, people trying to gather too many things, collect too many things, spend too many things. If you reduce living to just the things that you need, then it becomes much more simple. Basically, that's the argument to return to nature. There aren't all of these man-made things. There's not as much technology interfering with what we do from day to day. Alrighty. Okay. One reason, they give you a little background on the Walden Pond. And it says here he decided that he wanted to live deliberately or with purpose. So remember, purpose is a why sort of thing. So living deliberately is he wanted to have direct control over what he did and why he was doing it. If he gets up to do something, it's to provide sustenance for him later. It's to fix something that's broken that will affect his quality of life. Instead of just, going to do things just to do things, he talked about how important it is to just do what's necessary for survival. And then he talks about how industrialization that is the gearing up of technology to mass produce things, doesn't fit in with that outlook. So like mass producing things, basically all of the work that people have to do, this is extra stuff. You work really hard for money, so that you can afford things that make you feel fancy or look fancy. But do you need that to survive? Do you need those things to survive? You just need simple clothes. You just need simple ways to get food. All of the extra stuff is a lot. And he basically was saying, you know, like the government and city life in general being civilized is forcing people to think that they need all these things, but they don't. There's an excerpt here that says, "We do not ride on the railroad. It rides upon us." So basically what he's trying to say is we've gotten to the point where civilization is just improving just to improve. There needs to be a point where society in different places say like, okay, this is enough. We're going to stop innovating. We're going to stop trying to do things better. What we need to do is not move so fast at trying to make changes. We need to focus on trying to fix what's wrong with the way that we live today before we move on to other technologies. And because industrialization involved like erecting factories and things like that, it tore down a lot of nature specific locations. And so the Transcendentalists were not about factories and living spaces taking over the natural world. They also believed that industrialization just sort of makes everyone into like sort of a pack rat in the race, right? So you don't recognize people's individual talents when they're all just here at work to do this one same thing for you. You don't get to put people in places where they belong. You don't get to look at someone's creativity and say, hey, this, you seem like you're really good at figuring out how things work. So maybe you can figure out how to fix certain things for me. Whereas someone else might be good at singing, someone else might be good at writing. But if you're all caught you know, in the same workspace doing things that don't have anything to do with your talent, you're basically making everyone the same instead of acknowledging the things that are unique about them. And this is something that people can identify with today. There's a lot of discussions about how companies and employers don't care about the people who work for them, about how society and capitalism pushes people to abandon the things that make them unique so that they can make money. There's a lot of discussions about this right now in the world. And you can find them on YouTube, on TikTok, on all across social media. People are talking about this. And this is one of the movements that helped inspire that kind of thinking. Let's see. There's also a really weird point, and I always find this hilarious about Walden. And about Henry David Thoreau. There's a whole section of him basically just saying that he doesn't like the Postal Service or the press. And he basically goes kind of like on this tirade about it in the book. And he basically just says that like he doesn't think that exchanging thoughts with people is worth the price that's paid for you to send a letter to someone. He thinks you should just go and visit a person if you want to spend time with them and exchange ideas with them. And the same way with the news, he feels like there's no real new news. There's just the same events happening to different people over different times. So he feels like we're paying them to do a job that's unnecessary and that we can do ourselves. He like really hated the post office, you guys. It's just actually kind of ridiculous. Alrighty. Okay, so here we go into imagery a little more, patterns of imagery. So they give you a list of things that you should be familiar with. We've got adjectives, imagery, nouns, sensory details, tones, and verb stuff. Now, you can look up any of these things with a Google search. We have the resource course here for you guys to use, which also has these things on there. The English summaries has some of these concepts on there, but a quick Google search will do just as well. You don't have to sift through a bunch of, you know, like PowerPoints and things like that. You can literally just look through the just look through a Google search or some explanation and find out what these are. A lot of these are parts of speech. So adjectives are words that you use to describe things. If someone is doing something, or rather, if someone is beautiful, beautiful is an adjective, old is an adjective, cracked is an adjective. Verbs are words that indicate movement or action. So I'm going to the store, go is a verb. Nouns are people, places, and things. You, if you're referring to yourself, you are a noun. If you say I'm going to the store is a noun. The I is a placeholder for a noun because you are a person. If you refer to someone by name, names are nouns. So I'm just kind of going through these real quick to get you guys, like caught up, just in case you don't quite remember, but you don't need to do like a deep dive into your notes either. Tone has to do with how an author feels about what they're writing about. So you can tell by the words that they use whether or not they like something, and that's what tone is. Imagery, we talked about this earlier. Imagery is when you use words like adjectives and analogies. Like, for example, when we were talking about comparing the choppy waters to society, you get the imagery of the water. Imagery, they describe the water, the waves. Describing them as choppy makes you think of like waves that are crashing against each other, right? And the fact that he uses words like sea, we've been talking about him moving next to a pond. Those are bodies of water that you can picture. So imagery is just fancy descriptions that help you imagine something better. And then sensory details go into imagery as well. So sensory is like, your senses, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, touch. And if you use words to describe something that allow you to imagine what something looks like, sounds like, tastes like, smell like, or touch wise, what it might feel like, those are considered sensory details. So you can describe something in terms of imagery and focus on what it looks like, for example. But some people get a little more creative and they can describe smells very well. They can describe textures, how something feels really well. And all of those come together for imagery. So it tells you in this first sentence, authors use imagery to make their writing more descriptive and to help readers imagine what's being said by appealing to the senses. And then they give you the definition. A pattern of imagery is a particular image or description that's repeated throughout a section of a work or the entire work in order to elaborate a theme for the work. So it's when you repeat a specific image over and over. If, for example, you write a book and it's about a young person who retreats into their imaginary worlds to like get away from when they feel bad about things that are happening to them. Maybe the world they escape to is like a forest. So if you show the forest appearing multiple times throughout the work and you describe it to your readers every time that person goes into their imagination, that's a pattern of imagery because you're describing the same place and picture of the place over and over. And it's important to note here that usually if someone is repeating something, it's to emphasize it. So if you see something over and over in a book, even if it's just a word, even if it's a couple, like a phrase, a couple words together, when you start seeing the same thing over and over, people choose to do that on purpose because they want you to focus on the thing that's repeating. So if you have a pattern of imagery, that's the same image being described over and over and over. That's telling you that it's important to the work or to the ideas that they're trying to express in the work. So they give you an example of it here. It says, read this excerpt from the conclusion of Thoreau's Walden. Notice how the groups of related words highlighted in different colors create a pattern of imagery. So I'm not going to go over this excerpt because I feel like he writes in modern enough English for you to be able to sort of get the gist of it without too much difficulty. If you don't understand what's happening here, then you're probably going to have a hard time reading the excerpt as well. And if that's the case, then what you're going to want to do is schedule tutoring with someone so that we can go over the entire excerpt and make sure that you understand everything that's there. But all of these colored words are grouped together. These are things that are related to each other. Even if you're just looking at this excerpt and you haven't read the reading selection yet, you can tell by the colors how things are related. So basically, a summary of what's happening here, in case that helps you when you go through it, is that Thoreau is describing pathways to his home from the woods. So think of like dirt roads. That's what they have pictured here on the side. He's describing them and using them to tell a story to compare to the type of paths that people take in their life. So he's turning this image that exists physically where he is into a metaphor to talk about other people, excuse me, and the decisions that they make. So he definitely makes a comparison to the pathways that the mind takes when they think about things. So remember, Transcendentalism is about breaking out, doing things on your own. So he talks about what it's like to be on a path that's been walked on by a million people versus a path that isn't used very much by anyone. To talk about how people just sort of like follow the things that other people do without thinking about which path is better, that kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to skip over to slide 25 because this is the focus on language section. So we talk about paradoxes and oxymora. So what's important is for you to understand what these two things are because they show up in some of the writings that we have here, and you'll probably see them in the future. So I'm going to give you the definition of these things first, and then we can talk about the examples that they give you. So first of all, they start off with paradoxes. So a paradox is a statement that seems like it's contradicting itself. So it seems like there's opposites here and it doesn't make sense. But when you think about it, it reveals an actual truth. So for example, they give you this picture off to the left. People say, is the glass empty or is it half full? Now, if something is half full, it's the same as being half empty. It's divided directly in half, right? So half empty or half full seems like something that doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't matter. It's half filled regardless. But the point of the turn, like the turn of phrase, the reason why people say half empty or half full is because it's important to note that the way that you think about things influences which words you choose. If you view things negatively, you'll see the glass as half empty. If you are optimistic, you see the glass as half full. Being half empty means it implies that the glass is on its way to being empty. Someone else is going to take the rest of what's in there. But if you use half full, you're implying and assuming that someone's going to come by and fill it up again. So maybe it's only half filled now, but it's about to be all the way full, which is much more optimistic. And then they give you another example here. What a pity that youth must be wasted on the young. So they ask you, what do you think Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw meant when he made this statement? Basically, what he's saying is that we'll deal with it on the surface first. On the surface, it says that youth is wasted on the young. It can't actually be wasted on the young if we're talking literal sense, because young people are living, they are alive, they are doing things. So youth isn't wasted if you're actually alive and young. But what it's supposed to what it is supposed to reference is the fact that the energy and the carefree nature of being young is something that if you're young, you can't take full advantage of. You don't fully know about the world and how it functions. So it's impossible for you to make the most of what you want to do because you're lacking information. So it's almost like, because you can't live to be your full potential when you're young because you don't even know what it is, it's almost like that's being wasted. And that being young is something that you appreciate more when you're older. That's basically the point that he's making. So again, a paradox is a statement that seems like it contradicts itself and doesn't make any sense. But when you look at the layers of meaning, double or triple meanings, it's talking about a bigger picture and it actually does make sense. Let's see. So they talk about oxymora. So an oxymoron, that's the singular. If you have one oxymoron, it ends in O-N. If you have more than one, it's oxymora, which is O-R-A. So an oxymoron is when you have a contradiction that happens in a short, usually one or two words. So a paradox is a whole phrase. You're making a statement that seems like it's contradictory. An oxymoron is when you have one word that's made up of two parts that seem like they're opposites, or you have a phrase that has a couple words in it that's contrasting. So I give you some examples here. Chiaroscuro is a word that's used to describe contrasting light and shade in art and literature. It means light dark when you just break it down. Like they literally just took those two words and smashed it together. So when you look at the word itself, you're like, light dark, what does that mean? If it's light, then it's not dark. If it's dark, then it's not light. Why are these two words together? But the idea is that by putting them together, you're describing what it means to have dark and light colors in close quarters in one piece of art. And then they give you an example, an excerpt from Romeo and Juliet, and they want you to take a look and read it to see how many oxymorons can you, or oxymora, can you identify. And then they ask you, what does each mean? So they give you pretty much the explanation for them at the bottom, but they want you to read and try to see if you can pick them out yourself. And I think that's it for these slides. Yep. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Yeah, so the important thing to keep in mind is that Transcendentalism is a movement that comes from Romanticism, and that it's about discovering yourself through nature and through keeping your life simple, the way that nature was intended, and about not just allowing your life to be dictated by the rules of society. So the things that we read just sort of reinforce that. If you are having any trouble with understanding the presentation I just went through, the tutorial, or the mastery test, or any of the readings, please book a tutoring session so we can try to go over things and make sure you understand them a little more thoroughly. Sometimes it helps if you hear it more than once. Sometimes it helps if you hear it in a different way. So just make sure that you reach out. Other than that, my name is Miss Amber, and I'm signing off. Good luck with your English class.